US President Donald Trump says both Ukraine and Russia will have to cede land to each other to end the war, and that his talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin will be aimed at making sure a deal is reached. Trump told the White House press conference that his talks on Friday with Putin in Alaska will be a feel-out meeting to determine whether Putin was willing to make a deal. He said he could know within 2 minutes whether progress was possible. Trump also said a future meeting could include Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and could end up being a three-way session, including himself and Putin. He said he would speak to European leaders soon after his talks with Putin, and that his goal was a speedy ceasefire in the bloody conflict. Trump has in the past talked about land swaps, but neither Russia nor Ukraine have been interested in ceding land to each other as part of a peace deal. Europeans worry that major concessions to Russia could create security problems for the West in the future.
I thought it was very respectful that the president of Russia is coming to our country as opposed to us going to his country or even a third-party place. But I think we'll have constructive conversations. Then after that meeting, immediately, maybe as I'm flying out, maybe as I'm leaving the room, I'll be calling the European leaders who I get along with very well.
All 26 European Union leaders have declared that Ukrainians must have the freedom to determine their own future, insisting that any diplomatic settlement to the war must safeguard both Ukrainian and European security interests. In a joint statement, the leaders stressed that meaningful peace talks can only take place under a ceasefire or a significant reduction in hostilities. The declaration published Tuesday was signed by every EU member except Hungary, underscoring divisions within the bloc over strategy toward Moscow. The show of unity from the majority of EU capitals comes just days before US President Donald Trump meets Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, amid concerns Kiev could face pressure to accept concessions. Well, and to discuss this details I just read out now, let's hear again from International Affairs Analyst Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Marek, glad to have you join us. EU leaders are warning that Ukrainian borders must not be withdrawn. Is that in the discussion with Trump and Putin? B, are they just raising alarm in case? And then C, how can they even stop it if that becomes the case?
First and foremost, it is quite clear that President Donald Trump is not going to sign anything on Friday. These are very much talks at exploring the possibility of what Russians are prepared to sign for, including his own ideas, what Russia should be prepared to cede of its claimed territory. Please note, not all its claimed territory is actually being occupied by Russia. This minor point, but it does exist. Number two, this in turn implies that as he's already stated, that President Zelensky must be present at the next meeting. And so all this talk about America forcing Ukraine to cede land at Friday's meeting is, on the face of what Donald Trump is saying, untrue. However, what is true is that President Donald Trump has in mind that Ukraine should be ceding territory, and as he's determined to push this forward as far as it can be seen. And as a result, were Russia to agree with President Donald Trump's plan, but President Zelensky not agree with it, then the blame for the continuing strife, the continuing war, would then fall upon President Zelensky, according to President Donald Trump's narrative. And at which point it means that sanctions might be lifted on Russia, for example, because Russia is agreeing with President Donald Trump. And being a businessman, there is indeed a great deal of potential business to be done with Russia. So there's actually this third possibility, which is the key one, and not, as you suggested, the actual handing over of territory in any sense.
From what you've just said, it's looking like Trump is kowtowing to what Putin wants. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that. I do know that, of course, people who support President Zelensky's demand that Russians leave all territory occupied from, shall we say, 2013, to make it very clear, in other words, pre the seizure of Crimea, see any concession to Russia as automatically kowtowing, as total surrender, and so on. In point of fact, were it handled properly, and unfortunately this does not appear to be totally the case, because I would have, in my book, stated that it should be called a compromise. In the sense of it being a compromise, then there would indeed be a possibility, because after all, world history does not consist purely of Chamberlain and Churchill and how to stand up to Adolf Hitler, and here, in this case, President Putin. We had 6,000 years of history, and negotiations are possible. What is happening, though, is that we have seen, if you like, right from the word go, very sharp demands from both sides. If it must be also stated that President Putin still probably has in mind the conquest of the whole of Ukraine. That should also be noted. But the point of fact, negotiations in principle should occur, and they should not be held in an atmosphere that whatever is agreed, unless it is exactly what President Zelensky wants, and as stated as his terms, is a kowtowing to Russia.
What do you make of 26 out of 27 EU leaders signing the whole agreement after their meeting? Only one, Viktor Orban of Hungary, did not sign. Why did he not sign? And this sounds like a real unity among the European leaders.
Yes. First of all, let's take up the point, which is a very important point you've made. There is an unprecedented degree of unity, because the EU normally isn't known for its wholesale unity, Hungary apart. And this is, of course, very good for Europe in the sense at last it's speaking with one voice. 2 points, however, have to be made. First and foremost, what effect this will have on Donald Trump? Because the Europeans tend to couch their communiques as orders. Europe is no longer in charge. Russia and America do not have to do what Europe suggests. That includes President Donald Trump. So if you were to take the EU communique seriously, he might find a slight irritation there. As far as I can tell, he is simply going to ignore it for what it stands and then tell the Europeans what he's agreed to, what he thinks should be done. And so in this point of view, I don't think any damage will be done in that respect. And some good will be done in the general sense of supporting Ukraine. There is a third point, however. Russia's case, or Russia says, is never actually presented on television or in the media in the West, or if it is poo-pooed or ridiculed. The fact of the matter is, for some Russians living in eastern Ukraine, there was a genuine separatist movement, and Viktor Orban of Hungary has, of course, pointed this out. The problem is, to refer to my previous point that I made, is that whenever someone says anything outside of what President Zelensky's demands are of the pre-2014 annexation of Crimea, is automatically seen as being pro-Russian and kowtowing to Russia and so on. And as I've indicated, if there's any possibility of finishing this war, it may be possible to do so by means of a compromise, but not if anything without meeting President Zelensky's demands at present. Then it must be seen as being a negotiation. Is it possible to negotiate with Russia? Yes, it is very difficult. But as things stand, for 3.5 years, there has been no serious negotiation. That should also be remembered.
Listen to this quote from the European leaders. The people of Ukraine must have the freedom to decide their future. How does this statement affect the entire equation?
It's an interesting point because, again, we must debate what we mean by the people of Ukraine. This is never actually stated. But as far as one can tell, there were people in eastern Ukraine who do not agree with what the rest of Ukraine wants. Now, these have been called separatists, and indeed that's what they are. As when you say the people of Ukraine, I think what they mean is the Ukrainian Ukrainians, if I can put it like that, as opposed to Russian Ukrainians. And there is a very strong case to be made out. But the Russian viewpoint is simply never taken on board. And the implication of how this sentence is couched is that the whole of Ukraine, as Ukraine, one and indivisible, to quote the 1905 Russian constitution, and it must be restored, and only it can decide what is good or bad. Well, according to many years of history, we've got 6,000 years of it, this is not always the best approach. And moreover, it has, and this is never made as a point, but some of the borders were actually administrative changes made during the USSR. These points aren't made, and so we have already, coming from the Europeans and Ukrainians, a quite clear set of demands which shows one good aspect, that Europe is supporting Ukraine, but in the spirit of, if you like, either all Ukraine's demands or nothing is possible, it will result in no further movement towards peace.
They have agreed, I'm talking about European leaders now, or pledged to continue providing military support to Ukraine. How much of an encouragement is that to Zelensky and the Ukrainians?
Oh, without Western support, Ukraine couldn't hold out. When we say, for example, as you said in your run-up there, Ukraine had recovered 2 villages, without Western arms, none of this is possible. Ukraine itself would have long since gone. So any time they receive aid from the West is not only an encouragement, it's a sine qua non to Ukraine's existence. That Europe is prepared to pitch in is very important. And it will have the effect that, of course, Ukraine is no pushover, which is very important. However, if it encourages simply a set of demands from Ukraine that are impossible to negotiate, then we're back to where we've been for 3.5 years, where no single realistic peace proposal has come from the West.
EU leaders and Zelensky plan to speak to Trump ahead of this meeting with Putin on Friday in Alaska. Can you hazard a guess as to what will be the focal point of that meeting or of their discussion with Trump?
It is quite clear it's going to be a serious discussion. Russia is going to have its points and it's going to state what it is prepared not to press. That is the impression that's being given by what one can hear about the Russian side. They have their quite clear set of extreme demands, that's the conquest of the whole of Ukraine. They have a quite clear set of, if you like, strong demands, which is no Western troops in Ukraine, Ukraine neutralized, and of course the secession of all land, including that not currently occupied even by Russia. But it would appear that there's some leeway on this, and this is, I think, what Trump has in mind, and what I suspect has been going on behind the scenes. Quite what this would look like is unclear, but it may be that if Russia does receive land in the sense of being ceded to her officially de jure and not just de facto by means of occupation, that they might say, okay, Ukraine can join NATO, or there could be Western troops in NATO, in Ukraine, that is. The point here is we're guessing. But what is not a guess is that Russia is, as far as I can tell, prepared to be flexible to some degree. But of course, no way is that going to be anywhere near to what President Zelensky wants, and what the European Union has in mind.
Talking about this meeting between Trump and, of course, Putin, Trump called it a feel-out meeting, and that he'll be telling Putin, you've got to end this war. What does he mean by feel out?
I would actually say that that's not quite what he's going to say. That's not in fact a demand. It's his goal, President Trump's goal is to end the war, and obviously President Putin has got to lay out his stall a realistic one, and that's what I think President Donald Trump has in mind with this Feely meeting. The point is that already there are, of course, communications between Moscow and Washington, and so it's not going to be blind. The very fact that President Donald Trump is prepared to set up this meeting means he must have got some sort of concessions out of President Putin already, otherwise there'd be no point holding it. It would be just a gigantic humiliation for President Trump. The point to remember, there are two very important aspects. For President Putin, it's a win situation, however it works. He'll have actually been in America with an ICC warrant out against him. He'll have had a summit with President Donald Trump without President Zelensky being there, just like in the old days, America and Russia deciding the fate of the world as when USSR was around. And the other really difficult question, and this is one that Donald Trump I don't think is fully addressing, is will Russia keep to the peace accord? According to my books, Russia will simply move on and carry on its mischief making. And certainly history shows that Russians don't keep treaties well. In fact, in Poland's case, there isn't a single treaty which the Russians have held out in Poland. So therefore, these are other aspects which I don't think he's touching on, Donald Trump, which according to my books would be very important. Will Russia keep to an agreement? That is very important. And this I would like to see on this agenda. But yes, it is a meeting in which they're going to see what can be done to soften Russia's stance.
Well, Marek, the leader has talked about a just and lasting peace. One really wonders if this is even possible. But we'll leave it there. Thank you, international affairs analyst Dr. Marek Laskiewicz.